Humanity suffers from a profound, collective arrogance. We look up at the stars with massive telescopes, endlessly searching the terrifying vacuum of deep space for any microscopic sign of biological life. We spend billions of dollars sending robotic rovers to the freezing deserts of Mars, hoping to find fossilized bacteria. Yet we completely ignore the absolute most mysterious, unexplored, and inaccessible alien world in the entire solar system. A world that is located directly beneath our own feet. To this day, human beings have only managed to drill a mere 7.6 miles into the Earth's crust at the Kola Super Deep borehole. That is literally just scratching the microscopic surface of an incredibly massive, dynamic planet. We know exponentially more about the dark side of the moon than we do about the deep biosphere of our own world. But what if our ancient ancestors knew more? What if the absolute oldest complex civilization in recorded human history left us a highly detailed, terrifying warning that we are not the only intelligent biological species currently inhabiting this planet? Hidden deep within the highly restricted, climate-controlled archives of the University of Pennsylvania's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology lies a collection of shattered, unassuming clay tablets. Recovered from the ancient, wind-swept ruins of Nippur in modern-day Iraq. These tablets are inscribed with the wedge-shaped symbols of Sumerian cuneiform. They date back nearly 5,000 years. For decades, traditional scholars and religious historians translated these texts through the safe, comfortable lens of ancient mythology. They read stories about gods, monsters, and magical underworlds, casually dismissing them as the primitive fairy tales of a frightened, superstitious Bronze Age society. But modern linguistics, combined with recent, mind-bending discoveries in deep Earth geology and evolutionary biology, are forcing a massive, highly controversial re-evaluation of these ancient texts. When you strip away the religious metaphors and translate the Sumerian words literally, a terrifying historical narrative emerges. The tablets do not describe a spiritual afterlife or a magical hell. They explicitly, clinically describe a massive, biological, subterranean ecosystem, and more disturbingly, they document a separate, highly intelligent, highly adapted species that lives permanently below the surface of the Earth. To fully understand this terrifying ancient record, we have to deeply analyze one of the most famous, yet profoundly misunderstood, pieces of Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Atrahasis. Most people know this epic simply as the original, ancient precursor to the biblical story of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood. But the actual flood is only the second half of the story. The first half of the Atrahasis epic contains a highly detailed, deeply disturbing account of what the Earth was like long before humanity was ever created. The text explicitly states that before humans existed, the Earth was ruled by two distinct classes of beings. The higher echelon was known as the Anunnaki, the so-called gods of the sky and the surface. But beneath them, serving as a brutalized, enslaved labor force, was another distinct group of beings known as the Igigi. Mainstream historians have always lazily categorized the Igigi as lesser gods, or minor deities. But when you look at the actual literal Sumerian translation, there's absolutely nothing divine or magical about them. The text describes the Igigi in purely physical, biological, and industrial terms. They were a labor force. The tablets state that for over 3,000 years, the Igigi were forced to relentlessly dig massive trenches, clear out heavy rock, and mine deep into the Earth's crust to harvest minerals and redirect vast underground water channels. They were a species engineered or adapted for extreme physical labor in the total darkness of the deep Earth. The text describes them as suffering from severe exhaustion, physical degradation, and burning resentment. They were bleeding biological creatures, not ethereal spirits. Eventually, the Atrahasis epic documents a massive, violent planetary labor strike. The Igigi, pushed to the absolute brink of extinction by the brutal working conditions deep underground, violently rebelled against the Anunnaki surface dwellers. They set fire to their mining tools, surrounded the command centers, and demanded an immediate end to their subterranean enslavement. It was this exact, violent rebellion that forced the surface commanders to genetically engineer a brand new, much weaker, easily controllable replacement workforce to take over the heavy labor. That newly engineered species was humanity. We were created simply to replace the Igigi. But here is the massive, chilling question that modern historians completely gloss over. After humanity was created to take over the surface agriculture and the shallow mining, what exactly happened to the Igigi? The ancient Sumerian texts do not say they were completely exterminated. They do not say they flew away into space. The texts specifically state that the Igigi retreated. They were banished downward, deeper into a vast, terrifyingly massive subterranean realm that the Sumerians called the Abzu. For centuries, religious scholars confidently translated the word Abzu as a mythical, magical freshwater ocean of the underworld, a symbolic place of spiritual purity. But modern geologists, reading these ancient texts, are struck by how incredibly precise and scientifically accurate the Sumerian descriptions actually are. The Abzu was not a magical realm. The Sumerians were describing deep crustal aquifers. They were describing the massive, highly pressurized, water-bearing limestone and basalt networks that we now know definitively exist miles beneath the Earth's surface. The Sumerian tablets explicitly describe the Abzu as a physical, tangible environment characterized by massive caverns, roaring subterranean rivers, and total, crushing darkness, accessible only through highly specific, extremely dangerous, deep cave networks. When you read the texts literally, the narrative is not religious. It is deeply anthropological. The Igigi, a highly intelligent, physically robust species, perfectly adapted for deep earth excavation and survival in complete darkness, lost a massive territorial war against the surface dwellers. In response, they retreated into the deepest, most inaccessible, highly fortified cave systems and deep aquifers on the planet. They locked themselves away in the Abzu. They didn't die out. They adapted. They went deeper, entirely cutting themselves off from the harsh, violent surface world. They became a hidden apex troglodytic species. For over 100 years, mainstream biology aggressively dictated that this ancient narrative was absolutely, scientifically, impossible. Textbooks confidently stated that all complex biological life on Earth fundamentally relied on photosynthesis. Everything needed the sun. Without sunlight, there could be no plants. Without plants, there was no food chain. Therefore, the idea of a massive, thriving, complex biological ecosystem existing miles deep in the crushing darkness of the Earth's crust was dismissed as pure science fiction. The deepest parts of the Earth were considered a completely sterile, dead zone of solid rock and unimaginable heat. But then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, modern science experienced a terrifying, paradigm-shifting wake-up call. In 2018, the Deep Carbon Observatory, a massive, highly funded international research program involving over 1,000 scientists from 52 different countries, released their official, peer-reviewed findings after a decade of drilling deep into the Earth's crust. What they discovered completely shattered every single established rule of biology. They did not find a dead, sterile zone. They discovered what they officially dubbed a subterranean Galapagos. Miles beneath our feet, completely cut off from the sun, thriving in absolute darkness under crushing, mind-boggling physical pressure and extreme temperatures, researchers found a massive, sprawling, unimaginably vast biological ecosystem. And it wasn't just a few isolated pockets of bacteria. The scientists calculated that the deep biosphere contains approximately 23 billion tons of living organisms. To put that staggering, terrifying number into perspective, that is hundreds of times the combined weight of every single human being currently living on the surface of the planet. There's vastly more life beneath the surface of the Earth than there is upon it. These deep Earth organisms are known as extremophiles. They do not use photosynthesis. They survive through a bizarre process called chemosynthesis, literally eating raw minerals, consuming sulfur, and breathing iron directly from the surrounding rock. They operate on biological timescales that are almost incomprehensible to the human mind, with some deep Earth microbial colonies possessing lifespans stretching for thousands, perhaps millions of years, in a state of suspended slow-motion animation. While the Deep Carbon Observatory primarily found massive colonies of bacteria and archaea, evolutionary biologists were forced to ask a highly disturbing question. If the deep crust is absolutely teeming with billions of tons of biomass, providing a massive, unlimited foundational food source, what are the evolutionary limits of that dark ecosystem? On the surface of the Earth, bacteria eventually evolved into complex, multicellular life. Those multicellular organisms evolved into fish, reptiles, mammals, and eventually, highly intelligent primates. If a sprawling, resource-rich ecosystem has existed completely undisturbed miles underground for billions of years, protected from the asteroid impacts, ice ages, and solar radiation that repeatedly wiped out surface life, is it really so impossible to believe that a higher-order, complex, highly adapted predator could have evolved down there? Or, as the Sumerian tablets explicitly state, is it impossible to believe that a highly intelligent, previously surface-dwelling species like the Igigi could have migrated downwards, adapted to the dark, and utilized this massive biological food source to survive in the deep? If a highly intelligent, hominid-like species did retreat into the deep biosphere thousands of years ago, evolutionary biology tells us exactly what would happen to them over time. Troglomorphy is the biological process where creatures adapt to life in permanent darkness. We see it constantly in cave fish, deep-water crustaceans, and subterranean amphibians. If a humanoid species lived exclusively underground for millennia, their biology would drastically, horrifyingly, alter. They would lose all skin pigmentation, becoming a translucent, ghost-like white or deep gray, as melanin is completely useless without ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Their eyes would aggressively adapt. They would either become vastly larger, hypersensitive to capture the absolute faintest traces of bioluminescent light, or they would completely degrade and disappear, replaced by highly advanced echolocation, thermal sensing, or extreme electroreception. Their metabolic rates would plummet to conserve energy in a low-oxygen environment. They would become incredibly lean, sinewy, and cold-adapted. Fascinatingly, when you look back at the later, obscure Babylonian and Assyrian texts that evolved from the original Sumerian records, they describe the beings of the underworld in this exact, specific biological manner. They're described as pale, blind, insect-like entities that rely on touch and sound. They are said to wear garments made of strange, leathery fish skin, which modern researchers suggest could be an ancient interpretation of sealed, environmental survival suits necessary for navigating flooded, toxic, deep cave networks. The ancients were not inventing boogeymen. They were meticulously describing the terrifying biological realities of extreme troglodytic evolution. But if this hidden species exists, surely modern geologists would have detected their massive subterranean cities? Surely our advanced seismic equipment would have mapped massive artificial hollows in the crust? Well, the terrifying truth is that modern seismology has recently mapped massive, completely unexplained anomalies deep within the Earth, and scientists are at a complete loss to rationally explain what they are. Deep beneath the continent of Africa, and deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, geologists, utilizing highly advanced seismic tomography, have located two incredibly massive, structurally anomalous zones known as LLSVPs, or Large Low Shear Velocity Provinces. These are essentially two colossal, solid blobs embedded in the Earth's mantle, stretching for thousands of miles. They are larger than Mount Everest, larger than entire continents, and they possess a completely different chemical and structural density than the rest of the planet's interior. When seismic waves from massive earthquakes hit these regions, they dramatically slow down and scatter, indicating that the material inside is structurally highly complex. Mainstream geologists theorize that these massive blobs are simply ancient, dense tectonic plates that sank into the mantle billions of years ago and never fully melted. But a growing, highly controversial fringe of deep Earth researchers point out that the rigid, almost geometric boundaries of these massive anomalies suggest something else. While they are far too deep for any biological organism to currently inhabit, their very existence proves that the deep interior of our planet is not a uniform, solid ball of molten rock. It is a highly complex, layered, vastly unknown environment containing massive, distinct structural anomalies that we simply cannot explain. If structures the size of continents can remain hidden and unexplained in the mantle, what incredibly massive artificial cave systems or pressurized biological environments could easily remain completely hidden in the upper crust, safely nestled in the 23 billion tons of the deep biosphere? To find physical archaeological evidence of this ancient interaction between surface humanity and the deep dwellers, we do not have to look at seismic charts. We just have to travel to the breathtaking arid plains of Cappadocia in modern-day Turkey. Beneath this region lies one of the most baffling, terrifying, and inexplicable archaeological discoveries in human history, the ancient subterranean megacity of Derinkuyu. Discovered entirely by accident in 1963 when a local man knocked down a basement wall during a home renovation, Derinkuyu is an impossibly massive, highly complex, multi-level underground city carved directly into the volcanic rock. It extends over 280 feet deep into the earth, comprising at least 18 distinct, highly engineered levels. It contains massive ventilation shafts, deep water wells, stables, schools, armories, and living quarters capable of comfortably housing and hiding over 20,000 people, along with their livestock and food supplies. Mainstream archaeology universally claims that Derinkuyu and the dozens of other similar underground cities connected to it by miles of deep tunnels were built by early Christians around the 7th century AD to hide from invading Arab armies. But structural engineers and deep cave mining experts who have actually visited the site aggressively laugh at this timeline. The sheer, staggering volume of volcanic rock that had to be meticulously excavated, the highly advanced, flawless understanding of structural load-bearing physics required to prevent the entire multi-level system from instantly collapsing, and the incredibly complex deep-shaft ventilation dynamics required to keep 20,000 people from suffocating miles underground, strongly indicate a level of industrial engineering that simply did not exist in the 7th century. Many independent researchers and geologists argue that the early Christians merely found the upper levels of Derinkuyu already abandoned and simply moved in. The true age of the massive, deepest levels of the complex is entirely unknown, potentially dating back thousands and thousands of years to the Bronze Age, or even the time of the Sumerians. But the most terrifying aspect of Derinkuyu is not its age or its massive size. It is its security system. Throughout the winding, claustrophobic tunnels of the underground city, the ancient builders installed massive, perfectly circular stone rolling doors. These heavy, monolithic stone wheels, weighing thousands of pounds, were designed to be rolled across the passageway, completely sealing the tunnels. Mainstream historians claim these massive doors were used to block invading surface armies from getting further down into the city. But when you actually analyze the physical mechanics of the deepest levels of Derinkuyu, a chilling, terrifying reality emerges. At the absolute lowest, deepest, most inaccessible levels of the underground megacity, the massive stone rolling doors are not positioned to stop an enemy coming down from the surface. The tracks, the leverage points, and the sealing mechanisms are reversed. The deepest doors in Derinkuyu were explicitly, intentionally engineered to lock from the top down. They were not built to keep surface invaders out. They were desperately built to keep something incredibly dangerous, something coming from much further down in the dark, from getting up. Why would an ancient, highly advanced civilization spend decades, perhaps centuries, carving an impossibly massive city hundreds of feet deep into solid rock, only to heavily fortify the absolute lowest floors against an attack coming from the abyss below? The answer lies right back in the ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets. The surface dwellers were completely terrified of the Abzu. They knew exactly what lived in the deep. The Sumerian texts explicitly warn of the Udughul and the Asag, terrifying, relentless entities that would occasionally violently emerge from the deep, dark places of the earth. These texts describe them as bringing strange, wasting diseases, causing massive agricultural crop failures, and violently dragging people down into the darkness, never to be seen again. For centuries, we assumed these were just colorful metaphors for natural earthquakes, groundwater poisoning, or sudden sinkholes. But if you view them through the lens of a biological, highly adapted subterranean species occasionally breaching the surface to scavenge for resources, steal genetic material, or aggressively defend their territory, the ancient myths suddenly become deadly, historical survival accounts. Consider the sheer, terrifying logistics of our modern world. We have completely mapped the surface of the planet with highly advanced, high-resolution satellites. There's virtually nowhere left on the surface for a large, undocumented biological species to hide. But the surface of the Earth is absolutely microscopic compared to the staggering, unimaginable volume of the crust. The Earth's crust represents billions of cubic miles of completely unmapped, pitch-black, highly complex physical territory. It is riddled with massive fault lines, sprawling limestone karst networks, deep aquifers, and vast, hollow lava tubes that stretch for thousands of miles beneath the oceans and continents. If the Igigi of the Sumerian tablets, or whatever highly intelligent, evolutionary offshoot they actually represent, retreated into this incredibly vast, three-dimensional dark maze thousands of years ago, we would have absolutely no idea they were down there. They would be completely insulated from our radar, our thermal imaging, and our satellite surveillance. They would have an unlimited, massive food source in the 23 billion tons of the deep biosphere. They would have limitless geothermal energy to harness. And over the course of thousands of years, in the complete isolation of the abyss, their intelligence, their biological adaptations, and their technology would have evolved in ways that are completely alien and incomprehensible to human science. This terrifying theory perfectly explains some of the most baffling, persistent mysteries of modern times. Around the globe, from the deep, uncharted cave systems of the American Appalachian Mountains to the massive, unexplored sinkholes of China, there are thousands of highly credible, deeply disturbing reports of experienced cavers, geologists, and miners encountering completely inexplicable phenomena. They report hearing rhythmic, mechanical, highly organized sounds echoing from solid rock miles below the lowest known passages. They report sudden, impossible drops in temperature, massive, unexplained equipment failures, and highly toxic, localized gas venting that seems almost engineered to force them to turn back. Most disturbingly, the official records of the National Park Service and various global missing persons databases show a massive, highly statistically anomalous cluster of unexplained disappearances occurring directly around deep cave networks, massive fault lines, and heavily mined regions. People simply vanish without a single trace, without a single torn piece of clothing or a drop of blood left behind, almost as if the earth itself simply opened up and swallowed them whole. While mainstream authorities quickly blame animal attacks, exposure, or sudden disorientation, those who actually study the ancient texts cannot help but remember the terrifying Sumerian warnings about the entities of the Abzu dragging the unwary down into the eternal dark. The absolute most horrifying thought isn't that ancient aliens came from the stars to build the pyramids. The most horrifying thought is that we are sharing this incredibly small, fragile planet with a highly advanced, deeply resentful biological species that perfectly remembers we were the ones genetically engineered to replace them. The Sumerian tablets, shattered and covered in museum dust, are not crying out about the mythology of ancient gods. They're desperately trying to hand us the ultimate biological warning. They're telling us that humanity is not the apex predator of this planet. We are simply the temporary, ignorant caretakers of the surface. We live in the warm, comfortable light, utterly blind to the staggering, massive reality of the world beneath our feet. We build our fragile cities. We pave our roads. And we confidently walk across the thin, fragile crust of the earth, completely unaware that miles below us, in the eternal crushing darkness of the deep biosphere, another civilization might be silently listening to our footsteps. The next time you feel a deep, completely unexplainable primal wave of fear when looking down into a dark basement, an abandoned mine shaft, or the yawning black mouth of a deep cave, do not casually brush it off as an irrational, childish phobia. That sudden, cold panic is not a psychological flaw. It is a highly tuned, deeply embedded genetic memory inherited directly from the ancient world. It is the absolute terrifying realization that the darkness is not empty, and whatever was banished into the Abzu 5,000 years ago might eventually decide it is finally time to come back up.